Hello guys, welcome to another video, and in this one I wanted to do a bit of discussion on the brand new Reliquarian Ascendancy which has been unveiled for 3.29, and just as I expected, they are buffing the Reliquarian. It's going to be much stronger in 3.29 compared to 3.28. Of course there are a bunch of new nodes here, but just generally speaking the power level of the nodes is higher. And in this video, rather than doing kind of a full overview, I wanted to focus on one thing in particular. So, if you don't know how this Ascendancy works, basically it's an Ascendancy where you have to choose your nodes going around one direction or the other on the Ascendancy, and that's because of the amount of points you need to spend in either direction here. So you spend 3 points to get to your first node. That means that notably you don't get your first node until you've actually done your second lab. And you pick one of these, then you can go either up here and select a caster-themed weapon, or you can go down here and select, more of a melee or range-themed attack-based weapon, and then you actually go around and select one of these. You can't pick one at the top and one at the bottom, because that would be one too many points. That would be 9 points total spent. And that does have some interesting implications for Bloodlines as well with this Ascendancy, because, getting one of these last nodes here would spend your final 2 points, and actually spend all 8 points on your Ascendancy, which would mean you wouldn't then be able to use the Bloodline. So if you do want to use the Bloodline on this class, you can only select one of the first nodes and one of either of the second nodes here. You cannot select a third node option. Now, the one node that I'm really interested in for this particular patch is this one right here, the Black Cane. So this is a weapon. We'll actually go over to it here on the wiki here. The Black Cane is a scepter, and I actually made a video about this back in patch 3.26 because of some tech that you can do with another unique item that came into the game in that patch. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But this weapon has some different stats here, the important one being each summoned Phantasm grants you Phantasmal Might. So summoned Phantasms are minions that come from this support gem here. They also come from another skill, which we'll talk about in a moment. But basically, they are these minions that kind of throw out these projectiles that deal some damage. And you can see there that you have a chance to spawn these Phantasms when this is socketed in the skill. If the skill actually kills an enemy, or if it hits a rare or unique enemy, you have a chance to spawn these. And based on how many of these minions you have and which level the minions are, you will gain added damage to your spells. It's flat added physical damage. So you can see that it's 2 to 3 physical damage to spells per level, and that's going to be scaling up there, based on the level of the actual Phantasm. So with a level 21 support, this is 44 to 66, and that is for each Phantasm. So a level 21 Phantasm has a maximum of 11 summoned Phantasms. So you're going to be able to get a decent amount of flat added damage. But the problem with this weapon has always been that you need to actually use it and replace your main weapon with this, or perhaps, use it in combination with another scepter, maybe your dual-wielding scepters or something like that. But either way, you are replacing a potential very strong damage weapon with this, so it needs to provide you with a lot of flat damage. Now the thing is, this new Ascendancy right here, the Reliquarian in 3.29, is going to grant you this node without you having to use the weapon. So each summoned Phantasm grants you Phantasmal Might. That means that you don't need to use the weapon, and it does mean that you can use another weapon, which is the main thing that I want to talk about in this video, which is Soulwrest. So Soulwrest is a staff there which has trigger level 25 summon Phantasm skill when you consume a corpse. Now this is actually a different skill compared to the support gem, but it summons the same type of minion. So it's a skill which summons that exact minion, and this is actually the only way that you can get this particular skill, is by using this staff. So this is going to summon a level 25 Phantasm, and that means that you're going to gain the buff from the Black Cane there, the Phantasmal Might buff, as if it was a level 25 Phantasm, because that's exactly what it is. And we actually don't have the exact numbers here, but this is going to be approximately, 50 or 52 to around 78 added damage, something like that. It will be roughly around there per summoned Phantasm. So you're going to get an average of about 60 added physical damage to your spells per summoned Phantasm that you spawn. Now the interesting thing here is that Soulwrest, as an item, it has this skill baked in, which already has a baseline of 11 summoned maximum Phantasms there. So you can summon 11 of them by consuming corpses, and they have a 15-second duration. They do die quite easily, but you can do things to stop that from happening. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But the important interaction here is that you can actually socket the Summon Phantasm support gem into the staff, and what that does is it will inherit the line maximum number of summoned phantasms. So with a level 21 gem, it will inherit 11 extra summoned phantasms. So you go from having 11 to 22. Then you can use a very crucial item, which is what the previous video that I made on this interaction back in 326 was, which is the Dark Monarch. Now the Dark Monarch is a unique helmet. It drops exclusively from the Incarnation of Dread, and when this drops, and when you use a Divine Orb on it, you can actually randomize this modifier between a bunch of different minion types. This helmet doubles the amount of minions you can have for a particular type, but it prevents you from using any other type of minion in return. So it's kind of a big trade-off there. You can basically just have a huge amount of one minion type, and on this list is summoned phantasms. So, with this combination right here of the Soulwrest plus the socketed support gem there, you go from 22 to 44 summoned phantasms, which is kind of getting a bit ridiculous at this point. I can actually head over to PoE here and I can show you, this is a test character, so I can just show you exactly what's going on here. And this character has the Soulwrest staff with the level 21 summoned phantasm socketed into it. And I can just show you here by, desecrating some corpses and using Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction here. You can actually see that I'm able to summon a lot of these phantasms all the way up to the cap of 44. So that is the cap right here just with that setup. And that's going to give you a huge amount of flat added damage if you were to use it with that Black Cane node on the new Reliquarian. However, there's one other item that I want to talk about here, which unfortunately I don't have on this test character right here, but I can just mention exactly how it's going to work. And that is Congregation Spore, which is a brand new exceptional gem that came into the game last patch. And this one says 30 to 38% more maximum number of minions from supported skills. This actually goes up to 42% on a corrupted gem, so when you actually corrupt it from 3 to 4. And the way how this multiplier works is that it's applied on the maximum, and then that number is doubled, and then it will then, round down from there to get your final total. So this would go from 22 to 31.24, which would then be doubled, and you'd end up with a maximum of 62 summoned phantasms. Now, with 62 summoned phantasms, and with that approximate added damage of about 52 to 78 per summoned minion at level 25, that's going to give you 3,224 to 4,836 added physical damage to your spells, for an average of about 4,000 added damage. So 4,000 added damage with those 62 minions summoned, and that's going to basically be your entire engine for, dealing damage. You're not going to be scaling gem levels, you're instead going to be just adding a bunch of flat damage, and then you only really need to worry about the actual scaling of damage with your increases and more multipliers. Now that's one thing that I also want to mention in this video, is that Soulwrest is actually not the worst staff in terms of the other modifiers on it, because this is often used as, like a minion staff, but if you are to use it with the Black Cane, you actually get a bunch of really strong stats here alongside it that helps you deal damage, as you're the one using the spells to deal the damage rather than the minions. You get increased spell damage, you get increased cast speed, you have increased mana regeneration rate, and because you're constantly consuming corpses to actually spawn those phantasms in the first place, you will also always have 5% life regeneration. So those stats are not really to be scoffed at, they're really quite good. However, one problem you're going to run into with this kind of setup here is keeping those 60 or so minions active all the time. They do have a 15-second duration, so if you're able to consume corpse skills very, very quickly, then you can actually, keep them up relatively easily. But do keep in mind that these are minions, and they die very easily if you have no minion scaling. Now, one thing that you could do with that is you could actually make use of a cluster jewel node there. It's called Blessed Rebirth, and that has minions created recently cannot be damaged. So if you're able to, consume a bunch of corpse skills very, very quickly, you can basically guarantee that they stay alive for at least 4 seconds each. So that's one thing that you can look at. But the thing that I want to focus on in this video is actually a use case for kind of building around this, rather than just the whole setup of added damage. I'm considering using this with Volatile Dead, because I think this is actually going to be really quite good. So Volatile Dead is a corpse skill, and like other corpse skills, it explodes a corpse, but it also has a spell portion that goes with it. So each portion of this skill is a packet of damage. The corpse portion explodes the corpse and deals damage based on the corpse's maximum life, and that's not affected by any modifiers to spell damage. And then there's the spell portion, which is this kind of fire orb that gets spawned. I can show you that right here. you can see these fire orbs that get spawned, and they basically chase down enemies and explode on top of them for damage. That portion is affected by all modifiers to spells. So you're going to get the added damage on that portion of the skill, and all of your modifiers to things like spell damage will affect that portion of the skill. Now, this in and of itself is kind of a build which already functions, right? Because you're going to be able to use something like Volatile Dead, and I've actually got it socketed here with faster casting because this character doesn't have any cast speed scaling at all. But I'm using Spell Cascade, so every single usage of this will actually consume 9 corpses rather than 3, and that means that you can actually spawn a lot of these fire orbs very, very quickly, and it also means that every time you actually use this to deal damage, you're consuming corpses, which is, refreshing your phantasms, and you basically are going to be able to keep them up all the time. So you'll always have that flat added damage. So this is definitely something that I'm considering. It's not going to be for everyone because, of course, that is a 2-button build, but I did play Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction back in patch 3.23, I think, and I really enjoyed it quite a bit. So I'd like to revisit something like that, and this is going to be an interesting interaction to look around. Obviously, there are a few key pieces that kind of come into this build. Congregation support is one that adds a lot, but you don't really need it early on. The things that you really want are the Soulwrest staff and the Dark Monarch, but even just the Soulwrest staff on its own, you're already going to be at around 20 or so minions early on, and that should be providing you with quite a lot of flat damage, especially in those early maps. So that's definitely something that I'm going to consider in this patch. Now, one other thing that I wanted to mention in this video is just with a view to that build, what would you actually select on the Ascendancy if you were going for the Black Cane on the second node there? So you have the first node here and you have the last node over here. So let's actually take a look at what other options there are. So on the first node, there are quite a few really strong defensive options. I think it's quite important to point out here that using a staff usually puts you at a bit of a disadvantage because you can't use a shield or anything like that. And one of the nodes here that you can take on this first set of nodes is Dawnbreaker, which is 25% of each of cold, lightning, and physical, taken as fire. That also works for damage over time. That is really quite strong, especially if you're using a staff, because you're going to be able to build up quite a lot of physical damage taken as elemental. You can also use your body armor for Cloak of Flame or Lightning Coil, for example, and you're going to be able to pretty much solve incoming physical damage that way, so that's really quite strong. There's also Calm's Roots, which I think is quite a strong option here because you can get the benefits of Calm's Roots. That's the, not being able to be stunned or knocked back or having your action speed slow below base. You can have that without losing your sockets or the movement speed on your boot. So this is really quite a strong node there. You also get a bonus 100 maximum life, which is pretty nice. And the other option that I'll mention there on this first set is Edivore, because this is going to be nice early on to cap out your spell suppression or even just gain a big chunk of spell suppression. And then this recover 200 life when you suppress spell damage is a modifier that just feels incredible to play with and is something that's very strong on a character that has low recovery. Now, when it comes to the last set of nodes, I think this is actually where the Ascendancy is weak in some areas and strong in others. One of the really strong standout nodes there is Melding of the Flesh, particularly if you're going to do this kind of setup where you're using a staff and then you use, Dawnbreaker on the first set. You can shift a lot of the damage you take as physical into elemental, and then you can scale up your maximum elemental resistances by just scaling one of those 3 types. So this is definitely one to consider there on the last set. And lastly there, on this set, I will mention the Gloomfang, because that could be very strong with different spell options that you could use with this setup. But one thing that I want to mention is that because you've used your first 6 points on reaching the Black Cane node there, that means you have 2 points left. And that does mean that instead of speccing into one of these, you can actually take one Bloodline node instead. And there's a few interesting nodes on the Bloodline that you could take, especially on the Katarina Bloodline. The first is Umbral Army, which is 2% increased movement speed per summoned phantasm. Well, if you have, 60 plus phantasms, that's 120% or more movement speed coming from this node, so that is one option that you could look at. That could be really nice to just zoom around maps. There's also Prolonged Servitude, which I think is probably the underrated one here, which will feel really nice to play with, because this says minions cannot be killed, but die 6 seconds after being reduced to 1 life. This will be really strong if you're using Summon Phantasm with a build that doesn't have a very high corpse consumption rate, because that means that, instead of refreshing minions or just spawning new ones, you're basically relying on them not actually getting chunked by monsters, which happens very often actually. It's very often a projectile just flies past and destroys your minion if you have no kind of life scaling for it. So this one is going to be really quite good at keeping your minions alive, and that way you actually keep your added damage. But overall, I'm really happy with this Ascendancy that they've showcased here. I hope that they don't actually go in and nerf a bunch of these nodes like they did last time, because last time it was the case that they kind of showcased the Ascendancy in the reveal, and then they nerfed the stuff before the patch actually got released. So hopefully they don't do that with these nodes, and we actually reach the patch and we're able to play the builds that we're kind of theory crafting now. But overall, interesting Ascendancy, looks much stronger compared to what it was in 3.28. I'm looking forward to the full reveal, which is going to be tomorrow. So thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.